Hi everyone, this is Chaudhary, Psychotherapist, and today we have a very special episode because we're going to be talking about emotional detachment, numbness, and sibling estrangement. Now, emotional detachment is one of the realities that some people experience when it comes to sibling estrangement. It can lead to confusion and feelings of contention towards the perceived disinterest, lack of warmth, and withdrawal from a brother or sister when it comes to maintaining a relationship with us. Now, today's episode aims to shed some light on this particular situation that's more prevalent with some members of our community on Facebook. So today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author, and it's so great to have you here, Fern.
Oh, Ali John, always good to talk to you and to discuss these important topics, which affect so many of us in the community and, of course, in the larger world. This one is particularly interesting because we come to our siblings with certain hopes of reciprocity and mutuality, and we bring some expectations. And sometimes that sibling does not want the same type of relationship, and they push back and push away. And eventually we find ourselves lowering and lowering our expectations, which can lead to dialing down emotion. And suddenly we're in a different world. And many don't even recognize what they've done, but they have numbed themselves.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think that's so important that we talk about this because this happens to a number of us, and all of a sudden it's like we just don't recognize ourselves, right? And I think that this is an important topic because I think it's been with us for a long time and we've been noticing it with a number of people. So let's get into it. What is emotional detachment and what does it look like? You know, Emotional detachment refers to a situation where a person is either unwilling or unable to emotionally engage with others. So, we may feel sometimes a sense of coldness or just detachment and such, and we can, of course, react in all sorts of ways. Now typically how this presents itself with our siblings is that it can manifest in such a way that people that go through this, they tend to struggle with forming or sustaining close relationships despite our best efforts, right? And we can try and try, but we may be constantly getting this underwhelming feeling, right?
Yeah, it can lead to emotional instability when you're numb. It basically means that you are not identifying the significant experiences in your life because you're not really fully engaged in them. And, unless you can really label, which by the way, is why we talk about the importance of labeling feelings, unless you can label them, you may not know you have them.
It's interesting that you mentioned this because this is the type of work I do with some people, as a matter of fact.
Oh,
So it's interesting because of course people can have this inability to read cues, by just not manifesting interest, and they can appear distracted and not fully present in social situations, which of course makes it harder for other family members that may interact with them, especially, right?
well, and I think the real danger in it is that they don't know themselves
Yeah.
because they don't have authenticity in their relationships. They can't label their feelings, and consequently, they don't know who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that challenges in showing love or affection towards family members is certainly up there. When we open ourselves up, for example, and get very little acknowledgement, that really makes it hard, and we can have all sorts of adverse responses to that as well, towards this type of emotional numbness that people have sometimes.
It also, though, is a form of avoidance. You don't want to get hurt. So what do? You numb yourself and avoid feeling things.
Exactly, exactly. So in that sense, sometimes they'll avoid certain individuals, certain feelings, activities, places. Sometimes, so it can manifest in behaviors that can, of course, generalize in other places as well. And they can really be unresponsive. And that creates its own types of issues because we have difficulties reading them as well when people go emotionally numb. You don't want to feel that you're playing poker with a brother or sister, of course.
Right. There's also another contributing factor to all this, and that is if you have been abused or chronically injured by a sibling, there's some chance you have post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder is emotional numbing.
Yes, yes, and that's certainly a possibility that can happen with some people, of course, and we don't want to dismiss that, of course, and we'll of course get to that, I think, in terms of the reasons why this tends to appear, right, in that sense, and that's certainly one of them, mental health issues for sure. And I think that what happens is that oftentimes what makes this difficult for people is that there's little regard in showing empathy or active listening skills. I think that's the thing that happens, especially, right? And lack of empathy is a really big one because you're going towards somebody, you're opening up, and you're expecting a sense of reciprocity. And when you're not getting that, then you're opening yourself up to disappointment, right?
Right. Yeah, that's just a general decline in social skills, I'm afraid.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that happens, of course. And also, it's the idea of committing to relationships to another person, right? Some people want to have some sort of relationship by saying, we'll try to phone each other on a regular basis or whatnot, or hope to have that, but it just doesn't happen. So, this type of emotional numbness, for example, can create a sense of unreliability and unpredictability that can create stress and chaos for us, when we're experiencing that strenuous relationship with our sibling.
Well, it's interesting you're talking about that, and I'm thinking, okay, and how does this play into the limited relationship, which is a little bit different?
Yeah, yeah, of course. It's not always easy to define that because each relationship is different according to each person. But of course, if there are certain limitations that are set, then there are certain goals we set for ourselves to make sure that it stays on the surface, and sometimes we have to keep it surface level for our own good. Now, of course, if we're all conscious of that, then we might not experience as much disappointment, of course, and we're going to get into some of the strategies as well for it, I think, as we move along, you know.
Yeah, I just was gonna say, I think the important word that you use there is consciousness.
Yeah,
Whether,
exactly.
because emotional numbing can be far less conscious.
Exactly, exactly. And it can be due to many things. So I think that, in that sense, it's good that we talk about that because again, we've talked about some of the disappointment we have. And of course, the idea that sometimes it can manifest in different ways and generalize itself in different ways. And I do want to mention that sometimes it does happen that people physically isolate themselves as well, and that's also something to be considered, especially since the pandemic. There are some people that have been doing that, especially, you know. So, as we were saying, in some ways, sibling estrangement, can present all sorts of different manifestations, such as unevenness when we share about ourselves, lack of reciprocity, receptivity, or acknowledgement, and can leave us feeling empty, disappointed. And oftentimes it feels like rejection. And maybe you've experienced this where you get a sense of anger when you get the sense that your sibling doesn't respond in an appropriate manner and such with, say, good news or bad news that you come to them with, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, there's often that lack of connect, and that can, as we talked about in the beginning, that can lead to withdrawal.
Exactly. So let's try to ask that question or attempt to answer the question here of why are people numb with us? Why are they experiencing emotional numbness with us? And there can be many reasons why, right? And I think one of them is, of course, poor emotional regulation skills, that people choose avoidance instead of other more proactive coping mechanisms and such, right?
And I think there's another thing that's operating, which is in our society and communities that they don't value identifying emotion and they downplay feelings. And so we get into this bad practice of avoiding what we feel. And what that essentially does to you is put you on some sort of skate rather than, or, unconsciously, rather than actively engaging in your life and understanding your feelings and the implications of them.
You're absolutely right. I think that's the thing too. Consciousness is really, really important, and I think that that's key, especially, that you can find like these different types of coping mechanisms that could be helpful, of course. But you're right. I think the underlying issue is that it's seen as weakness and such, and it's a type of vulnerability that for some people is not good, when in fact it is one of the basic ingredients in building closeness with people, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's an important one. And for some people, like you were saying earlier, it can be a way to be, of course, distancing oneself from pain or other psychological factors like trauma, depression, or any type of mental health issue or personality traits that may present themselves and such, right?
Yeah, and suppressing your feelings can be valuable at certain moments, but it can be very harmful in the long term. And I think that's the key to this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. A one size fits all strategy is not the best because in that way, what happens is you're using that particular strategy with everything around you. So, you end up missing out on that. And that's what I would say to people that experience emotional numbness is you have to take some risks in cracking the shell and such. So that way you can, of course, open up a little bit more to get more of what you want, and with depression, it's really hard for some people because it's like a battery that's got limited power and such, and you've only got so much energy to carry yourself out, and sometimes the what happens is people pull back, especially, because they're trying to preserve their energy levels, but at the same time, that's the irony is that if you do more in that sense, then you will get more energy as well too, and the more you build on the social connections and such, actually, the more you will become happier as well, as according to what science demonstrates.
Yeah, and depression is often a component or a result of sibling estrangement. You can see on our page, many
Yep.
feel very low as a result of being shunned or having to shun themselves. It can also lead to a generalized reduction in trust. And that's a whole other important aspect of this.
Yep, absolutely. And I agree with you. I think that, like you said, it's the trust issue is a big one because we become responsive towards this emotional numbness. We start to, of course, pull back and such. And what can happen to us is that we end up perhaps becoming somebody that we don't like, when we're with our sibling or when we have that lack of contact with them, when we think about the situation and such, you know. And another factor also is, and this is mentioned sometimes in some places, is that sometimes people didn't get enough warmth or support from their mother as a child, and may have developed an avoidantly attached style, as
Yeah,
well. So
right.
that's also important to mention as a possibility, of course, but it's not everybody, but I just think it's important that we put that out there. And I was saying earlier as well, Fern, since the pandemic, there's some people that just are socially withdrawn and they experience what's called in Japanese hikikomori, which involves people becoming recluses and refusing to leave home, right? And such to go to school and such or to work. So it's interesting because this is a phenomenon that's been happening in other countries as well. So it might be that there might be a little bit of that since the pandemic, especially if some of the members of our community have noticed some changes since then with their brothers or sisters. That could be a possibility.
Yeah, I think you make such an important point about attachment styles and numbing because certain attachment styles will produce emotional numbing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to come back to this concept of estrangement related trust issues because you see, of course, emotional withdrawal in that, but you also see several other behaviors, including defensive posturing, people pleasing, and over eagerness to develop close but really unsustainable relationships, which can lead to abuse.
Yeah, and we have to be careful about that, of course, right? In that sense, because we may feel as though there's something that we should do, by trying to make ourselves better and such. And in some cases, it's good to, of course, want to self-improve. But there's other cases where we're constantly adapting to somebody that is being constantly detached, emotionally unavailable, and such. And it can make it more difficult because we're not seeing any adequate change or response, because of our actions. So, of course, the risk is that we can fall into a situation where we're butting our heads against ourselves, and the relationship that is largely non-existent, you know?
That's such a good point. Yeah, there's your numbness, but then there's also the question of what are you going to get from your sibling?
Right, exactly. So, Fern, let's talk about what we can do to experience wellness. I think that the what can we do question here is really important because a lot of our viewers may be asking themselves, well, what do we do with all this, right?
Mhm.
And I think that one of the things that I suggest with people is the idea of setting realistic expectations. And accepting that the emotionally detached person may not provide emotional support that you desire, and to adjust your expectations to prevent frustration and disappointment. Like we were talking earlier about, of course, adjusting ourselves with a surface level relationship.
Yeah, and I would add to that that labeling and identifying feelings, which is a practice that people have to be intentional about.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really, really important, of course. And the thing I would say also to people in our community is recognize it's not you. Nothing in how you were treated has to do with the actual person that you are. You may be accused or made to feel guilty by your sibling, but most often it's their own personal biases, their insecurities, their inadequate defense mechanisms, or interpretations that cause them to get stuck in seeing you in a particular way, right?
And project those things upon you.
Exactly. So it's really important that we, of course, be mindful of that, so that way we don't take this on. You know, Another thing we talk about, of course, is to build a support network, right? To seek emotional support from friends and other family members or support groups. Having a strong support system can help you to cope with the emotional gap, you know, because if we put our minds into just one single outcome that's saying, oh, somehow we have to patch things up, somehow we have to make this right, then what you're doing is you're limiting the possibilities. And that's not what we want for ourselves.
Yeah, and a lot of times voluntary kin or chosen family don't carry the same baggage as your own siblings.
Exactly. They validate us, they make us feel good, and in some of the support groups, they talk about this, how they have other people, of course, they reach out to give them that
Mhm.
precisely because they don't have it within their families.
Mhm.
And the other point I want to make also is the idea of focusing on what you can control. While our minds can venture towards what we don't control and create suffering for us, it's important that we recognize where it is that we can get caught up, and find ways to foster, emotional well-being for ourselves. So body care, narrative writing, engaging in self-compassion, or any other activity that fosters wonderment, I think is especially important, right?
Hmm. Right, and I'm always come back to the value of narrative writing or just emotional writing where you throw your feelings onto the page.
Exactly. So a good question to ask ourselves, of course, is to how can I seek well-being on a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual level? I think that's so important, right? Because we talk about self-care. What does that look like? And that's really important for us to sit down with ourselves and try to attempt to answer that question.
Yeah, I think we have to create a toolbox where we know what to do when we feel numb or low or depressed.
Yeah,
And those include things like walking in nature, getting exercise, calling a friend.
yeah,
Uh, there,
exactly.
there
Exactly.
are many things you can put into your toolbox.
Absolutely. Changing our response, and identifying, of course, different thought patterns that are not helpful and such. There's so many things that we can do that we could go on, but, I think people have some leads in terms of what they can do for themselves, of course. And yeah, so I think they can, of course, reach out to us if and when they need to, of course, because now's the time for us to talk about resources. We're almost out of time, you know. And I think that's really, really important, of course, to talk about that in terms of just recognizing that, we have different services that we can do to help people, of course, when it comes to working with sibling estrangement, you and I.
Mhm. Yeah, so I would say coaching is the thing that I offer in order to help people through some of the roughest spots in both personal and sibling relationships.
Yeah, yeah. And myself, I do psychotherapy, of course, and I help people in all sorts of places when it comes to individual, interpersonal issues, of course, that may be happening and affecting them in their lives, and seeing how we can, of course, get beyond that and create a plan for ourselves to empower ourselves to become
Mhm.
stronger, better people for us. So it's
Mhm.
always good to work with people that are estrangement informed like us and such. And I'm really glad that we're able to foster that conversation. So I do, of course, invite people to look at the links we have on the screen right now. And if you want, of course, do explore some of those. Those are very helpful. And of course, there's this online support group that I host. That's in the summer. It's going to be once a month. Outside of the summer, at that time, twice monthly. And if you want, you can get in touch with me to see more about that and register. So Fern, this has been a wonderful experience to be able to talk about this. I think this has been a subject that's been coming up more and more. And I'm so glad that you and I were able to, of course, dive deep into this. So thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I learn along with you.
Excellent. So we'll talk again very soon. You take care.
You too.
All
Bye.
right.